When I was 11, my school district was going through all this rapid growth, and they were building a second middle school. We had a junior high, but it was running out of room. So one school, like the old junior high, I think, was turned into a school just for sixth grade. So I think 8 elementary schools all came together in one big building at EFL school. And and it was the first time that kids from like poorer schools mixed with kids from the richer schools. And like there were kids who were jocks. We didn't really have jocks at our school because we weren't the rich school. And it was, I remember I was really, for the first time, conscious. Well, no, it wasn't the first. So more than ever in my life, I was really conscious of class and of being poor and looking different, not having nice clothes, not living in a house where I wanted to invite people over because it wasn't fancy. It was in a bad neighborhood. Although at that time we'd moved to a nicer neighborhood. It was a nice neighborhood. But I remember one day this girl who was a friend of mine, I think she was like in my homeroom, and we were sitting at lunch, and she had kind of like this false bravado. And she was like a really friendly girl. She got along with everyone. She dressed a little bit sexy, like she was a little more mature, but she got along with all the girls really well. And she said, or I was 11, maybe 11 and 12. And she said, I think we should go around and all talk about how we lost our virginity. Um, and then she proceeded to say how she had been at a sleepover and was alone in the living room, and her friend's brother came in and forced her down and said, "You're going to have sex with me." And the word she used was she lost her virginity. And I knew that was called rape. I knew that he wasn't supposed to do that, but I was so pissed at her for like talking about that. Because people would say she was a slut, and then she would say we were sluts. They would say we were sluts for being friends with her, and I was just mad at her for talking. And but I mentioned that because for most poor girls, at least poor girls in rural Michigan, or I mean, my town was 30,000 people, so that's not technically rural. Um, oh my gosh, rural, juror. It's a really hard word. Uh, but there's sort of a baseline of violence that most women experience that I think a lot of times when I've spent time with more privileged liberal women, um, it happens a lot with celebrity culture. Some of the things that people talk about, for people like this girl who lost her virginity, getting raped at 11, the celebrity gossip stuff wouldn't even register for her. And you may say, oh, she's not educated. She doesn't know how bad she has it. But maybe she knows how bad she has it, and you're not educated because you don't know what the baseline of violence and sexual exploitation is of poor women in this country. I think it's the latter. So, one of the things I appreciated about going to jail was being with women who didn't sit around whining a lot, but at the same time had a sensitivity to the brutality of the world that most of us were navigating. Like I said, when I moved into E3, I bonded right away. I learned that our mortal enemies were E4 on the other side, otherwise known as E4 whores. And so I never participated in this activity. In fact, I did not like this activity as a pod mate, but one activity a lot of girls enjoyed to pass the time was screaming at the wall. So they would scream at the wall and then scream at the wall. Sometimes kick the wall, sometimes throw things at the wall. And then there was like a event where if you really wanted to get a message, you'd go and talk to them, like if you needed somebody to loan you coffee or something, or if you just wanted to threaten somebody, which I didn't do, but other people did. Um, so yeah, because once you're screaming at the wall, it's just two people screaming at the wall. So really, it's you're kind of both. Well, I'm not going to explain it, but I didn't try to explain it then because you kind of just have to go with the flow. People really don't want you to stand out and be honest. You just like to, people want to avoid conflict because most of us come from trauma backgrounds. In my experience, like uh, if you go to jail and you walk into, what's called a pod, and most people are in pods nowadays, which would be either separate little sleeping cells in like a common area or like ours, like a big room with up to 12 women. So, and then it's called a pod because it's a big room, I guess. Technically, we're supposed to leave it, I think. But when you walk into a pod, if the biggest woman there comes up to you and says, first thing you need to know is there's no pod boss. And if anyone says there's a pod boss, they're lying. Then she's the pod boss. Because, like, usually, like, the angriest, biggest woman, people really don't want to upset her. So, she's kind of in charge. But then women have a very egalitarian sensibility. So she doesn't want to admit that she tells everyone what to do because she's large and violent. So she would never say she's the boss. It's just we all always happen to agree. But we're mostly all from backgrounds of childhood abuse. So we know how it works. We know who to keep happy, when to smile and nod, and, when somebody's about to lose it. Before I had come in to E3, the first night, understandably, I think, because I was arrested for yelling at somebody and I didn't threaten them and I didn't damage property, I didn't make anybody afraid that I would hurt them, but I was charged with a felony with a 4-year sentence. So, understandably, I think my first night, I was a little bit paranoid, thinking that, maybe I was being put in jail with a big possible 4 years in prison hanging over me to kind of like push me into actually committing a crime to get me in jail. Some would say that is a symptom of my psychosis, which has never actually been diagnosed, or no symptoms of psychosis have ever presented despite my 7 months being locked up. But some people would say me being paranoid that night when I was arrested for a felony I didn't commit, but thinking that maybe somebody was trying to catch me committing a crime. Some would say that's a delusion. But I think it's sensible because a tactic that law enforcement uses is they use many different tactics, but one of them is to make you think that you're going to face a very serious charge and then either confess to another crime that you actually committed, or they can manage to get you to hit them or hit somebody in jail, and all of a sudden you got an assault and see, I told you so. So I suspected that I might be being baited. And especially since there were a number of empty cells, but there were two women in with me. And one of them was Opal. And this was a woman with very few teeth, very rough looking, gravelly voice. Um, and then a younger woman. And the younger woman was whining a lot, like all night long. And she was trying to call somebody to bail her out, and just going on the phone, and like, and then like saying, what? And like whining on the phone all night. And I just ignored them and like, kept my head covered and pretended to sleep or tried to sleep. And then as morning came along, so both of them I would encounter later, even though I wasn't in their cell. So let's call, the young woman Brittany. Brittany's whining and pounding the phone again. And I just went, I'm so mad, and kind of like mimicked her like pounding the buttons, which was a bitchy of me, but I hadn't slept. I was in jail. And Opal just like really quickly accelerated and like I felt like it was an overreaction. And then she started like talking about how they were gonna really like lay into me once I got back there. And I was like, it's a county jail in Michigan. I'm an old woman. This is not Oz. You know, somebody might hurt my feelings, call me a Karen. They're probably not wrong. I've talked to a lot of managers, I confess. Sometimes you have to. You just have to talk to the fucking manager, and I stand by every time. But yeah, I wasn't expecting to necessarily be loved in jail, but I wasn't afraid of people murdering me in my sleep because that's not the normal population. I figured there'd be a bunch of drug addicts and people who um, maybe got into car accidents, and I was right. But Opal was trying to scare me, and I because I felt like I was being entrapped, I made sure my whole body was turned towards the camera. I sat like in a meditative position with my hands like this, and I started singing show tunes to be a cunt. And then the guards took me out. So whether she was faking as I thought or was going to assault me because I was being a cunt, they thought I should be removed from Opal. Um, so that was a little bit of paranoia, but once I was back in the cell, I really got along with everybody there. I'm trying to use like pseudonyms, so I'm trying to remember everybody's name. If I don't, I'll just like beep it out. But I once I was back in E3, once I'd been fully booked in, I got along with most of the girls, except there was this one girl I'll call her Paula. But she was a very angry woman, and she'd been there almost a year. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia and on very heavy drugs, and had nobody told me this at the time, but I think she'd already assaulted at least two women in the jail, and I know she would assault another woman while I was there. She never seemed to get along with me, but we both knew how to play euchre, so there was kind of a detente there. I tried to get along with anyone who was decent at cards because some of them knew, but were just like really bad at cards, or they would cheat, but they were too big for you to say anything because they couldn't handle criticism. So a good card player was really nice. Even one later, when I was pretty sure she was a cop, I was like, well, she's a cop who can play euchre, so I'm okay. But I became close with these two girls, Kat and Bella. Um, Bella was a tall girl who was not a pod boss, and Kat was like this husky voice girl who she had rapidly lost like 250 pounds. She was thin, she looked good. She also had an OnlyFans, so we talked about that. But she had a lot of skin because she'd so rapidly lost weight, and her doctor wanted her to get checked out because she thought she had something very serious. But Kat was just kind of not wanting to get it checked out. So a lot of them are very short term in their thinking and planning. Um, but they would joke that she was Bella's wife, and we joked about how, because Kat was leaving in a few days, that I would take over as Bella's wife when she left. Nobody ever was actually like, physical or romantic, but we did joke a lot about jail wives and bunkies, and I think everyone does because you're on top of each other and you kind of have to make light of it. I met one girl. She wasn't very popular because sometimes women would, I mean, they'd come in, I guess, high or I don't know what circumstance, and they just wouldn't bathe. Probably paranoia, like they didn't want people stealing their things if they went in the shower, which they do. They didn't do it to me. Like that's why you have to kind of really get along with the whole pod, otherwise they will let people steal from you. But she was apparent. They told me that she smelled so bad that they had to force her to take a shower. But she was her hair was definitely greasy, but she didn't smell too bad when I met her. But she promised to put a note on Instagram to because at that point I had over 3,000 followers, and a lot of my friends from my network, we stayed in touch on Instagram. And she said she'd post some comments I named some handles to look for. And I don't think she ever did because, no, Nerd Juice, Brody Dale, she actually hired a private investigator because the people I knew on Instagram didn't know where I was. So, and I didn't tell people when I was in Asheville because my life was easier not to say where I was. And then when I left Asheville to come to Michigan, I didn't tell people that I was no longer in Asheville. And so Brody Dale hired a private investigator in Asheville, and I was far from there. So she wouldn't have pulled up like police reports. Um, and my mom had made contact with me, but it was my mom's thesis that I was psychotic. So I guess I had blocked her on my Instagram, but she had people who followed it. So I asked her to please just let people know where I was. And of course, she didn't, because I think she really enjoyed being the only person who communicated with me. Nobody else ever communicated with me, including my brother. I would say not my father. Um, I managed to get 2 letters out. The pastor's wife, I figured she would use the internet to find addresses for churches, so she gave me the address for Old St. Pat's, and I tried to write to my old spiritual director there, but I didn't hear back. And I also asked her to talk to. I have a friend who's a nun who sings in the choir, but I didn't hear back. And then I wrote a note to the church in Evanston where I went and asked the secretary to pass to my friend. Barb, I love you. I know you watch sometimes. I didn't ask you if they gave you the note because I didn't want to know if you got it. But I didn't hear back from Barb. So I felt very lonely. And as a spiritual exercise, I thought, well, this is what it means to die. It's kind of, some people get to have those funerals and see what happens when they die. And I got to see that I can disappear and nothing happens. So that didn't make me feel so great about me, but that's true. Oh, and I know occasionally I would talk to my mother, and it was ridiculous because she's the reason that she sent a volume of stuff to my own attorney, who's not supposed to communicate with my mother. I never indicated I wanted her to. And she made decisions without my consent, against my express orders, driven by input from my mother that I didn't review and discuss with Lori Shearer. Lori Shearer's a piece of shit. What can I say? Then I talked to my mother, and it wasn't like a secret. I don't think my mother was dense enough to think that I didn't know she'd talked to my attorney. I just don't know why they're holding you so long. And she refused to bail me out. She could have bailed me out. I would have been able to keep my dog and, go to appointments and things. But instead, she kept me locked up and had my dog surrendered. And because of her actions with my attorney, I was held. And this is the fun part. I didn't have any incidents of behavior. I am a goddamn delight, as a matter of fact. And so there was no rush for the Center for Forensic Psychiatry to evaluate me because I wasn't presenting with what's called symptoms. So there in Montcalm County Jail, there's a special needs pod. And, people with developmental disabilities, they are placed in there. And there's one for women. There were beds. I was never placed in there. I was never placed in isolation. I was never disciplined. I never had symptoms. I never saw the nurse or doctor except for my intake visit when they, weighed me. And I wasn't on any medications. I raw dogged the entire 7 months, Advil, because I was sleeping on a piece of metal. And so while this is happening because of my mother's actions, they still have to have me assessed. So I had to wait 3 months to get assessed and to get a bed. And then because a judge said I needed to go, it didn't matter how the assessment went. I was going, and I had to go serve my time in the loony bin, where they want you to falsely confess. They want you to say, oh yeah, I was so stressed out. I was just hearing things, but now that I've tried Risperdal, I feel just swell. But you'd have to confess to the sin for them to purge the demon. But there wasn't a demon. So I was like, um, you know what? I'm going to wait around for you to find the symptom. You're going to tell me what the symptom is, and then we'll talk about treating it. This was later when I was in Caro. And, and that gave me an insight, because as I sat there, I realized it's so hard when you have a disabled child and you're having claims constantly returned by insurance companies. And Medicaid is an insurer. And if you're saying to Medicaid, this woman has to be in in-state psychiatric care, very expensive, that's so important that Medicaid has to pay for it, but you don't have any symptoms. Well, I don't know. I kind of bet that at some point that would work out, that I would leave without taking any drugs. And that was true. But I didn't know that now. I didn't know I was going to get sent there. I just knew that I was talking to my mom. My mom had me sent to a loony bin and would not tell anyone where I was, and kept saying to me, I just don't know why they've kept you so long. Because you first had tried to have me committed, and then you successfully found a dim-witted country lawyer to do it for you. But a weird thing about E3 is, I mean, a lot of these girls were very young. Many were very unsophisticated. And if I was too paranoid, many of them just weren't paranoid enough. There were a lot of coincidences. There was this one woman, Sally, who was in on a retail fraud charge, shoplifting, but her house was a site of activity and commercial activity, and people just kept coming in who'd been at her house. So many people had been at her house, and it was like they talked about it like a social coincidence. And Bella, whose wife was Kat, she had a serious boyfriend who has a drug house in Ionia. And the first time she was arrested, because one of the guards was the deputy there when she was arrested, she was blowing her boyfriend in his garage. And she thought it was just so funny because they arrested her on some sort of like child support warrant or probation violation or something and took her in. And she's like, yeah, but like his garage is where he had all the meth and the equipment and stuff like that. So they left the drug house and took the woman. And then she was arrested the second time. This dude who owns the drug house in Ionia but never gets arrested, he had driven off of his property with her in his car. And she dropped a cigarette outside her window. And they were pulled over because she littered, which happens all the time in reality. And they brought her in on a child support warrant. Oh, because she owes back child support for the two babies DCFS took from her because of her drug addiction. That's pretty common. States put in measure, amnesty programs, but I think right now MAGA, they're not so into granting mercy for trash like us. But like, they were so naive about how they should behave considering some of the serious situations they were in. Like this one girl, and she really was only 20, 22, Mary. I was asking her about her charge because I knew that she was being offered going to rehab, so I knew it was drug related. And I said, you don't have any distribution charges, do you? And she said, no, I'm a dealer. It's like, yeah. And she would talk to me about that. And I was the only person in the cell facing a felony and not a drug user. So like, really, you don't want to tell the woman who is facing a felony and doesn't do drugs about drugs. There's nothing to be gained from that. And you should know like what it's called when you're committing crimes that have like decades of prison. You really should Google it, sweetie. But I just tried to talk her into a new profession. I told her she had really good people skills, that, she should, be in customer service or something, but not selling that product. I don't think I persuaded her. I think she had a passion for what she did. I think one of the hardest things for me just made me sad. They were all Trumpy, um, or they kept their mouth shut. But I think most of them were genuinely Trumpy. But most of them had internalized so much self-hatred. They would say things like, if somebody complained, don't do the crime if you don't want to do the time. And in a jail, a lot of people are on pretrial hold. So, you know, liberals say that you're innocent until proven guilty because the Constitution says that. But I mean, that's not how law enforcement behaves, right? Judges don't treat rural with pre-convict suspects. They don't say, oh, I wonder if he did it. They just say, officer, what should we do to this person who obviously did it? That's why he or she is here. That's more the attitude. And I have always, strongly advocated for reform in the criminal justice system. I mean, mostly on the extreme end, I was really passionately against the death penalty since I became aware of it. But I just, as a matter of principle, knowing how unfair so many systems are, having heard and read so many stories about people wrongfully imprisoned of all races and backgrounds, I just assume if someone is being detained in jail, the only thing I know is that a judge ordered that person to be detained. That doesn't tell me anything, but that person empowered to be a judge ordered this person to be in jail. And sometimes people would be in jail even when there wasn't an order. Like this girl, it was the girl they had to put in the shower. So this was like a frequent flyer at the jail. So she was treated with a certain level of contempt because she knew she would probably be arrested again. So she had to be really nice as part of it. But she went to court at like 10 in the morning and the judge wrote the order freeing her. But I think the deputy just forgot to check the mail. So they forgot to let her out. And the night shift sergeant got really mad and like screamed at her for asking to leave. So my point is, they held her for many hours after the judge had ordered her out because they forgot to get the paper. So other than that, usually if you're in jail, someone has ordered you to be there. Oh, and she said another time, Montcalm County Jail, her husband was there when someone else went out in his place and escaped. So they didn't let him go because they had to go like up the highway and find the guy walking in the greens up Highway 66. And yeah, so they could be a little more careful about their paperwork in Montcalm County, I would suggest. From a distance, we could see the animal shelter for the county or for the township. And I had the darkest realization one day. It was like a Sunday or a holiday. And part of the reason I like to be on the top bunk was so I could look out the window. And I could see somebody there to walk the dogs. And I said, oh, yeah, of course they'd have to have someone come in on weekends to make sure the dogs go outside. Because you couldn't leave a dog inside in a cage without taking them outside for more than 24 hours. That would be insanely cruel. And then I realized that they could hold us and would hold us up to 10 months in this jail without us ever going outside. So I think some of these differences in experience are very important. Well, if you ever want to understand why the revolution happened, it's a good thing to realize is, for women in this situation, a lot of these women had been to jail before. Their moms had been to jail. Their grandmas had been to jail. And then, seeing ads with Sarah McLachlan and knowing that people who care and have money know about the dog suffering, but don't know about us because nobody talks about it. Nobody reports it. Nobody in the legal community wants to acknowledge that our civil rights matter or are worth pushing for. Nobody at Ms. Magazine thinks that equal rights amendment thing is really important for us to figure out so that we could sue when there's gender discrimination in jails. because uh, we've been buried alive and nobody cares.